Hi, I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, a historically humanist congregation, and this is Coffee and Wisdom, a humanist perspective on theological and philosophical questions. I've been talking about syncretism for the last week and now this week. And what is that? Well, Wikipedia tells us that syncretism is the combining of different beliefs in various schools of thought, and syncretism involves the merging or assimilation of several originally discrete traditions, especially in theology and mythology of religion. I've also been looking at the word sin as a way of looking at the syncretism of religions. Did sin appear in other kinds of traditions other than Christianity? And if it did, what did it look like in that? And I mentioned last week there is a book, A History of Sin. Actually, there's several out there looking at the concept of sin and how it has changed in the Western world. But as I mentioned last week, the syncretism angle of sin in other religions is much more problematic. Even in the Western tradition, for most of the time of our history, Marcus Aurelius was right when he said it is through ignorance and involuntarily that we sin. The idea being that no, it doesn't have anything to do with some kind of huge God out there making rules, but rather that we are somehow not living up to our best standards. And that's the more syncretic way of looking at the idea of sin. Sin is from the Old English, sin, S-Y-N-N, and singen being the verb, sinning. And it probably comes from the Latin word for guilt, although Old English also contained the word guilt in it. Uh, Beginning on Thursday, I was looking at the idea of evil and how the idea of evil has entered in with the idea of sin and kind of gotten mixed up in that. As we will look a little closer today, the word evil comes from evil. It is an Old English word of Germanic origins. And originally it meant bad or unfortunate. So you see, the word evil did not begin in English as where it has now gotten to. And we have to think about why that's the case. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy has this to say. Since World War II, moral, political, and legal philosophers have become increasingly interested in the concept of evil. This interest has been partly motivated by ascriptions of evil by laymen, social scientists, journalists, and politicians as they try to understand and respond to various atrocities and horrors, such as genocides, terrorist attacks, mass murders, and tortures and killing sprees by psychopathic serial killers. It seems that we cannot capture the moral significance of these actions and their perpetrators by calling them wrong or bad, or even very, very wrong or very, very bad. We need the concept of evil. And that is the argument for why this term has accelerated in its usage since the Second World War. The propaganda of the Second World War cast Adolf Hitler as the evil Satan of the world, and that indeed stuck as a descriptor of Adolf Hitler. So he became the embodiment of evil in the Western mind. Uh, a nice article from way back in 2002 by Ron Rosenbaum is called Degrees of Evil, Some Thoughts on Hitler, Bin Laden, and the Hierarchy of Wickedness. Now, Rosenbaum is semi-famous in Hitler studies for publishing a book called Explaining Hitler, The Search for the Origins of His Evil. And here, Rosenbaum is really looking seriously at the idea of, was Adolf Hitler evil? And if so, how come? What is the defining essence of that? Now, Rosenbaum writes about the other great historian who has looked at Hitler and was looking at Hitler from a very different perspective. The post-Holocaust debate over the definition of Hitler's evil can be said to have begun in 1947 when Trevor Roper published what was not just one of the first post-war biographies of Hitler, but also one of the first post-war divisions of his mind, The Last Days of Hitler by Hugh Trevor Roper, a book that was a bestseller when it came out in 1947 and has continued in print since because of its strong look at the last days of Hitler. He brought to the subject the shrewd perspective of a historian whose specialty before the war had been 16th and 17th century religious wars, and the even shrewder perspective of an experienced MI6 counterintelligence agent whose wartime tasks had been to maintain liaison with anti-Hitler plotters in Germany. And that is indeed the story of Hugh Trevor Roper, 1914 to 2003, the British historian. He had been in MI6 during the Second World War, was very much aware of the plot to kill Hitler toward the end of the Second World War. And Hugh Trevor Roper was an MI6 agent then allowed to talk to the people who had last known Adolf Hitler, trying to figure out how Hitler had died, which was unknown at that time. And indeed, what we do know about the bunker, which is now famous, was discovered by Trevor Roper in his Outlook. Trevor Roper said this about history: history is not merely what happened, it is what happened in the context of what might have happened. And that's the way he looks at history. This is what he wrote about the Second World War. When the goddess Reason was set up as the idol of a sanguinary dictatorship and the French Enlightenment was carried over the continent by military force, the charms of both faded quickly. And so the idea of reason became part of the Nazi program, Hugh Trevor Roper is saying, and also the idea of the French Enlightenment being spread by the ideas of Nazism across Europe by force. And indeed, we still have a question that Rosenbaum and Trevor Roper set up here as polar opposites in the way they're seeing it. Was Adolf Hitler sincere in his beliefs, or a con man out for his own purposes? Both sides of this issue are still argued regularly. And also the question that really gets down to the essence of this idea of evil: does sincerity or conviction make actions less evil? Because you really believe in them and that they are good, are they evil or less evil? Here we have a photograph of Adolf Hitler saying his prayers. And he said this: I intend to set up a 1,000-year Reich, and anyone who supports me in this battle is a fellow fighter for a unique spiritual, I would say divine creation. And so Hitler was using the terms of Christian understanding as a way to communicate his idea of the Third Reich. Now, the counter to this after the Second World War was Hannah Arendt's idea from Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. As I mentioned last Thursday, Hannah Arendt was at the Nuremberg trials, and she was especially interested in Eichmann's trial. Here's this horrible man who had sculpted the Holocaust and made it happen, but he sure did look like just about everybody else. And so she began to think that evil is banal. She wrote this: the sad truth is that most evil is done by people who never make up their minds to be good or evil. And politically, the weakness of the argument has always been that choose the lesser evil forget very quickly that they chose evil. And so evil is perpetrated by just the neighbors next door as it goes on. This idea of comparing things to Hitler has really caught fire, and it is indeed a real defining kind of idea for our time. We have a cartoon here: compare things to Hitler for $5. And yes, you can compare your dog and your bird and your toaster to Hitler just to see how evil they might be. And indeed, Alec Ryrie, from a book called Unbelievers: An Emotional History of Doubt, talks about how since the Second World War, the idea of evil has overtaken the idea of good as a way to have a compass or a moral barometer. So he writes this. Once the most potent moral figure in Western culture was Jesus Christ. Believer or unbeliever, you took your ethical bearings from him or professed to. To question his morals was to expose yourself as a monster. Now, the most potent moral figure in Western culture is Adolf Hitler. It is as monstrous to praise him as it would once have been to disparage Jesus. And Alec Ryrie's point here, and he is a historian of Protestantism, a British historian of Protestantism. His idea is that one of the secular ideas that has gotten implanted in our culture is what would Hitler do? And that's the bad thing, and therefore marks out what the good thing would be. And we no longer refer to the good of Jesus. It's a very potent argument and has gained a lot of traction. Now, this has been around for a long time in various ways. Reductio ad Hitlerium was a term coined by political philosopher Leo Strauss way back in 1953. We can reduce everything to a very simple moral, yes or no, good or bad, by reducing it to a idea of Hitler or Nazism. And also we have Godwin's law, which says the longer an internet discussion goes on, the more likely it is to end in someone mentioning Hitler or Nazis. And so the idea of evil in Western Europe and its many colonies has become the idea of Adolf Hitler and what would the Nazis do? And let's do just the opposite. That must be the good thing to do. It's an evil kind of set up by historical past, but then we can certainly see how this can be argued over. And this idea of Hitler and Nazis and evil being conflated very much in the news in our own day as we talk about the war in Ukraine. And this is really the origin of the whole discussion that we're having nowadays. Thanks for listening today. On Thursday, we'll be looking back at syncretism taking the flag. That is, ideas of religion melding together to become some kind of a new holistic moral attitude in the human brain. Join me on Thursday, or if you have any comments or questions, I am minister at firstunitarian.org. Always glad to engage in conversation about these what I find to be fascinating issues. Thanks for joining me today.